Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Samwick, and I'm the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center and a professor of economics here at Dartmouth. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's program on Photography and History, a Conversation. Our speakers this afternoon are Professor Annalise Orlick and Liz Cooke, who recently collaborated on the book, We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Our event this afternoon is part of the Rockefeller Center's 35th anniversary celebrations, and I encourage you to visit our website, rockefeller.dartmouth.edu, to stay abreast of our programming this spring. It is a special joy for me to feature one of Dartmouth's celebrated professors of history and her collaborator. We will host a book signing and photo display of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now at a reception following this event upstairs in the Hinman Forum. Annalise Orlick is professor of history at Dartmouth College. Her areas of expertise include U.S. history since the Civil War, U.S. political history, women and American radicalism, race, ethnicity, and immigration, Jewish immigration, and gay and lesbian studies. Growing up in Brooklyn, New York, her interest in the study of history and ethnicity grew out of her hometown's wide variety of diverse cultures. We Are All Fast Food Workers Now continues her scholarship about activism by low-income and marginalized communities. Her prior books include Common Sense and a Little Fire, Women in Working Class Politics in the United States, 1900 to 1965, The Soviet Jewish Americans, on which she also collaborated with Ms. Cooke, Storming Caesar's Palace, How Black Mothers Fought Their Own War on Poverty, and Rethinking American Women's Activism. Liz Cooke was also born and raised in Brooklyn. She is the recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to photograph Holocaust survivors and Soviet emigres in her childhood neighborhood of Brighton Beach. Her work has appeared in numerous publications. Most recently, her photographs of Newburgh, New York were featured in The Guardian. Liz is the founder of Abandoned Hudson Valley, a photographic exploration of abandoned and neglected places of the Hudson Valley. We Are All Fast Food Workers Now tells the story of low-wage workers rising up around the world to demand respect and a living wage. What stands out to me is the commonality of the experience, both across industries and around the world. We learn about workers and activists who were small farmers, fast food servers, retail workers, hotel housekeepers, garment workers, home health care aides, airport workers, and adjunct professors. They live and work in many parts of the U.S. as well as countries around the world, including Bangladesh, Cambodia, Mexico, South Africa, and the Philippines. As an economist here today learning from historians, I come to our discussion with a question. Can a globally integrated, market-oriented economy really do no better by these workers and their families than wages that keep them in or flirting with poverty, often working in unsafe conditions and without the respect that many of us may take for granted? Perhaps an answer will follow. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Annalise Orlick and Liz Cooke.
I want to thank Andrew and Joanne Needham for putting this together. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank my students who I corralled into being here. There's food upstairs afterwards, so you can enjoy that. Liz Cooke and I have been collaborating for a very long time. We met in the 7th grade, and she almost brought a picture of us in the 7th grade, so.
Post it later.
And so the question that we're interested in talking about here, for those of you who know me, and there are many in this room, and for those who have to sit and listen to me talk in class 3 times a week this term, the question is, how do you get information about history, about a time, about a place, and about the fragility of that, the evanescence of so many things. So we're going to show pictures that Liz has taken over 30 years. The first set of pictures that you'll see are from our childhood home in Brooklyn, and pictures that we took as part of this National Endowment for the Humanities project we did fresh out of college, about our neighborhood, which was changing fast, and with a sense that that the Holocaust survivors that we interviewed for that project would not be there forever, and that the neighborhood itself was changing because of the largest influx of Soviet immigrants anywhere in the world outside of Israel. And so, so we begin there, and I think the question is, how do you convey historical information? How do you convey those moments? I talk and write a lot, but I think there's a whole different sense of what you can learn and know and feel from visual imagery. And for that reason, we've worked together on a number of different projects over the years. Soviet Jewish Americans, a book called The Jews of Brooklyn, which Liz has covers for, and finally this project. And we can talk about our new project when we get there. But first, I take you back to a time and a place that no longer exists.
We're going to start with a quote. And this says, "There is nothing in this world that does not have a decisive moment." And anybody here who is a photographer or has studied the work of Henri Cartier-Bresson is probably familiar with what he describes as the decisive moment. And we tend to think of that as something that happens in about a 60th of a second, you know, a person jumping over a puddle and just that flash. But I think when Annalise and I talk about a decisive moment, we're talking about a moment that lasts longer. It could be the time of a revolution. It could be a time of exceptional amounts of change. Today, there's a fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. I don't know if people have seen it. And there is a tremendous amount of photography that's happening around that. Almost everybody I saw was out there taking pictures. And there's something about capturing a moment in history that is extremely compelling. So these are the books.
Yes.
And this is an image from, Annalise, what year?
1980.
1980. This is Brighton Beach. If anybody is familiar with Brighton or Coney Island or that part of Brooklyn, when people talk about Brooklyn, they tend to talk about Williamsburg or, you know, Park Slope or the Heights. But we're from the other part of Brooklyn. And we were fortunate. I think we considered ourselves very lucky to be in this incredibly interesting neighborhood right on the beach, right on the boardwalk, right next to Coney Island.
So these essays, I mean, these photographs capture a moment that in the Jews of Brooklyn, we put in an essay called Waves on the Sand. And we called it Waves on the Sand because Brighton Beach was the site, not just, it's known now as Little Odessa, right, in the place where you have so many Soviet immigrants, and which, as I told Andrew, I mark my words, will come out to be at the center of Trump Russia, but that's another story. And I'm not kidding. There were, it was the site of upward mobility for East European Jewish immigrants who came out of Russia and Poland and Central Europe at the turn of the 20th century, and who moved to the Lower East Side, who moved to Brownsville, who moved to very crowded parts of Brooklyn, and moved up, in a sense, to a middle-class existence by moving out to Brighton Beach. It was also the site during the Great Depression of families living very much as they are right now in New York, you know, 2, 3, 4 generations crowding together in an apartment because that's the only way they could afford to live together. But out there on the beach, on the sand, it was a site of socialist and communist activism, the centers of the socialist and communist parties in New York in the 1930s. And the 1940s, the next wave came, and that was Holocaust survivors. It was one of the biggest concentrations of Holocaust survivors in the country. And as the Soviet Jews were coming in, we were very conscious of the world in which we grew up, a world in which there were communist songs sung on the boardwalk on a summer night, and also a world in which we would go to a cafe, and I learned about the Holocaust, and probably Liz did too, by seeing the numbers on the arms of the people who were serving us food. And we were very, very aware that that world was changing. And here are some images from that world.
When we get to a more contemporary portfolio, you'll see that my style of shooting hasn't changed at all. It's either people sort of semi-profile or dead center in the middle of the frame. But this is a Holocaust survivor named Sam Glantz, and he's reading his Yisker book, which is a collection of information from the shtetls of Europe.
after the war, Holocaust survivors got together to try to remember their towns and the way they were before the war. And he has got his finger in one of those Yisker books, but it's in Yiddish. And so he's describing to us life in his town.
It's worth noting that if anybody is doing genealogical research on Jewish history, one of the really rich areas to explore are the Yisker books of Europe. Those are online. So when we talk about history, even then there was real acknowledgement that these stories and histories in these villages was going to be important for future generations, and lo and behold it is.
And one of the interesting things is we're conscious in this moment as young people of listening to stories of a world that is literally no more in the Jewish towns of Europe, told by someone who was part of a community that we grew up in that was also fading, right? So that the layers of that were very, very poignant.
In some ways, we're lucky that we have photographs. I mean, I'm sometimes struck that future generations are going to see every detail about us, like every detail. And we have next to nothing from even 2 generations ago. So things are changing, and photographs are absolutely going to be a huge part of that, as are your tweets. This is Elsie. This is taken at Brighton Beach Baths. If anybody's from Brighton, you know what I'm talking about. Annalise and I would just go to places and talk to people, and we were young. And could I say how old we were? I think we were 20?
21.
We were 20, okay. 20, 21, and we wanted to know people, and we wanted to know their stories. And I never shot with a telephoto lens. I never shot with a long lens. The longest, even now, I think is like 80 millimeter. You know, like I just go right up to people, like I'm right in their faces. This is actually a distance for me.
Here, wait, let's hold on for a second. This
Yeah.
is another Holocaust survivor, and I think this is the importance of imagery, right? You know, I could tell you Elsie's story, and even with her words, it's really a beautiful tale of how she would go to dance outside every day to lift her spirits up, and how it got her, it enabled her to go on with her life. This was her dancing outfit, that she'd come to the Brighton Beach Baths outside and dance. But there's a somberness. It's a Holocaust story. There's a somberness to it that is belied by her look, right? She is glorying in her life, the dailiness of it, the experience of dancing, and so this image not only is up here on this wall, but sits across from my bed. So I get up in the morning and think about what Elsie faced every day.
Annalise is a lifelong fan. She's a stan. Bob Arick kind of lived behind a place called Club 28, fed cats, fed the stray cats, and he gave us a little tour of what it was like back there. I'm going to move a little bit faster. Is that okay?
Okay, but I do want to say one thing.
Please do.
Okay. This is the face. Bob's a homeless guy. He lived where Brighton Beach met Coney Island, under the ruins of a building that used to be a dance hall, and the last vestiges of a racetrack, a horse racing track that was there. And the last thing you would expect is, although you should, right, is that as Brooklyn gentrified, that the repository of memory of that neighborhood and what it was a homeless guy living in the ruins, right? Who took us to see murals, who took us to see pieces of history in those ruins.
That was also my first experience going through an abandoned building, and it stuck. This is a typical scene in Brighton. I mean, for us, this is normal. This is like, hey, you know, we're just walking out on the boardwalk. But I think we realized that Brighton Beach was unique, really special, really unique. And we, again, were, I think, really lucky. This is the Rebbitzin. This is the rabbi's wife in a shul that is no more. And she was lovely, and she took us through and gave us a great tour of the synagogue.
She's showing us her copy of Good Housekeeping, where Linda Ronstadt is her favorite performer. This was an interesting moment too, because she was describing, she's from an Orthodox synagogue where the men and women sat separately. But she was describing her sense that immigrants were more able to bring the customs of the old country in a way that was flexible, right? And she was actually disturbed by what she felt like was an increasing rigidity in, in orthodoxy. Come on down, Matt. And so, yeah, again, I think the power of the image stays with me and with that memory. Yes?
Didn't she also have some expression about under the Rebbitzins' table?
No, that was my mother. And it was under the Rebbitzins' bed.
Okay, wow, okay, that's a story I'm going to want to hear. I'll post that one also. Annalise, you want to talk a little bit about Jewish culture in Brighton? Because especially when we get to the global nature of the fast food workers book, we're going to really be talking about a lot of different cultures, but in some ways Brighton was very sort of a cohesive Jewish culture.
Yeah, we met her at a funeral march, and on the day that Notre Dame is burning, it's appropriate to tell this story. We met her in a funeral march for a synagogue that had been burned in some kind of arson. We were working for this little community newspaper out of college, and we were sent to cover it. And they were carrying the Torah through the streets because you're not supposed to bury it. You're supposed to give the Torah a funeral, especially when there's some kind of act of violence. And so there was a sense that everyone in this neighborhood understood that, right? Everyone in this neighborhood was somehow part of this world. We already weren't. We already had to have it explained to us. But yeah, the culture in the streets, in the synagogues, Yiddish was many people's first language. And it was the oldest, and that's partly why we knew it was so evanescent. It was the oldest population outside of Miami Beach, right? In terms of where the elderly lived.
It's and of course Yiddish faded. I don't know the state of Yiddish language now, but I know that in my household, I knew I was in trouble when my parents broke out the Yiddish. You know, it would be a lot of improbable words and then Liz. So
it's spoken primarily by the ultra-Orthodox now, but that was a moment when it was a language of social radicalism and secular Jewish identity as well as religious.
This is a typical photo that I would take, like, just again, people like frozen. But that's how they wanted to be seen, and that's how they wanted to be known, together, really close on that little love seat.
You know, and again, oral history and imagery, they were telling us stories about the 1905 revolution in Russia, which they had been involved in. This is Isidore Katz, and we interviewed his whole family. We interviewed them, we interviewed their children. We talked about the dangers of being the difficulties of being the child of a radical who, as one of his daughters said, sees the whole world but doesn't always see the home and the kitchen table right in front of you. And again, just a moment in time that's long gone. There's nobody around who remembers the 1905 revolution anymore and has those stories to tell. But the imagery of it is captured in this domestic scene.
If we get our act together, and I hope we do, we've talked about putting together a website with this material, but also the audio. We have tapes, and we do have tapes.
We have tapes.
Okay. Okay. I hope we get to that. The boardwalk, kids, Brighton.
Pre-gentrified Brooklyn.
Yeah. Yeah, especially love the tough guy at the end over there. Kids probably about of our generation. It probably looks a little bit like Saturday Night Fever, and there's a reason, because that was just a couple of neighborhoods away. We had some interesting people in the neighborhood. This is Jaime, and he would wheel his baby carriage, and everybody knew him.
In the late 1970s, when New York City was broke, they deinstitutionalized the nonviolent mentally ill. And people got on trains and went out to the end of the subway line, which was Brighton Beach. And remarkably, as part of this coherent community, people took care of these folks, and they were homeless people with names and stories, and people who were collectively cared for. And this was Jaime, who we grew up knowing as if he was a relative.
He worked at the hardware store. He worked at the hardware store, I think it was on 3rd Street, and he would make his deliveries in the baby carriage. This is also a scene from Brighton. I call this my Ouija photo. And yeah, don't have too much to say, except sometimes you take pictures of hard things as well. You'll see some again in the later work. There were beautiful things as well. Brighton Beach all of a sudden was getting a little glamorous. Russians were coming.
I don't know about that.
I don't know about that either. But I used to call it there was a fish store, and they put a disco ball on the ceiling of the fish store. Yes. So it was. I think it was glamorous Brighton style.
Yes.
These guys were just walking out of a synagogue, and again, just like a moment in time, And that's the avenue. Probably still looks like that. I'm guessing it still looks like that. Annalise says she doesn't think it would look like that anymore, but I think there's still the people with the shopping carts, which we call wagons. Another moment. So street photography, just going out there and shooting. And something with a bunch of reflections. And that's also just like a typical moment in Brighton, long gone. This is inside the Brighton Beach baths. So, Annalise?
The Brighton Beach baths was sort of New York's working class resort. You didn't have to stay there. You took your subway out to the end of the line.
Boy, that's a stretch.
What?
That is a stretch.
Why?
Or the resort?
3 saltwater pools, dance floors, handball courts on the ocean. Surprise, surprise, it has been taken over by luxury condos, like so much of the city. So again, there is a moment of public space. There is a moment of public interaction that creates a New York City that is no more.
These are Mahjong Players. And this is the dance band shell. More dancers. Close up. And a scene from the boardwalk. And that is another scene from the boardwalk.
The boardwalk that is now kind of full of hipster Manhattanites come with their cameras and shooting video and
right, Mermaid Parade.
Yes.
And that is another moment in Brighton. We are in the present. We have advanced 30 years.
Yeah. So 30 years later, we became interested in capturing another moment in time, right? And that is the moment of neoliberal crisis that we live in right now, in which it was an adjunct professor who taught 12 courses a year for $30,000, commuting 24/7 between 3 campuses, who uttered the line, "We are all fast food workers now." And that, he said, something happened to your mic. I can always do my TV talk show. I've always wanted to do this. I can run around. So I like to do my classes too. A moment in time once again, right? When nobody is an employee, when everybody's an independent contractor, when no one is, for that reason, covered by the labor laws that the folks you saw, some of the folks, the old folks you saw in those first set of pictures, struggled to pass in the 30s and 40s and 50s and before. In trying to document the new global economy, it seemed really important, once again, to not simply get the stories, which we did, and which, if you're interested, you can find in the book that is outside and in the lobby and in the photographs that are on display upstairs. It seemed important to also convey the kind of information that you can only convey through imagery. So the photographs that you're about to see are the folks who are fighting for a living wage around the world. Garment workers, fast food workers, adjunct professors, hotel housekeepers, those who work harder than any of us can imagine, although there are probably some of us sitting in this room, and yet who in this neoliberal moment, who in this moment when 30 years in, just at the end of the time we were shooting those photographs in Brighton Beach, there was a kind of shift in the global consensus about what workers deserved, right? And a feeling that workers really are owed nothing, that the highest achievement of humankind collectively is increasing shareholder value, right? Which only benefits those who have money in the stock market. 30 years later, it's a crisis. And in 2012, workers started rising up in the fast food industry, striking Walmart, striking in the fields of where berries are grown for all of our morning cereal in San Quintin, Mexico, Baja California, and in Manila, in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, in South Africa, in the grape fields. So that's our project in this new study. We did the same thing we've been doing for all of these years, which is to go around and interview people. But somewhere in the middle of that interview, Liz would come in really close and begin to shoot people at times when their faces were revealing, when their gestures were revealing. And so we're about to introduce you to those folks. He's one of the main narrators of the book. Maybe you want to tell a story. This picture is taken 4 years ago on this very day, 4/15/15, at the big Fight for 15 march in New York City.
So in the course of doing this book, we've sort of landed on what we call like the hero shots. We've been published pretty extensively. A bunch of different online magazines and print magazines have picked up excerpts from Annalise's book and photographs as well. And for some reason, we always gravitate to the people who in their faces convey everything. I don't know if I have it. I don't think I do, but there's another picture of Blue where he is showing his forearm, which has scars on it, sort of a neat row of scars, which he suffered at the fry vat at McDonald's. And so we've shown that picture as well, and Annalise talks about that in the book because he was not alone. He was not the only person who had that scar. Throughout the world, there were others.
Yeah, and Blue, shortly after we took this picture, was invited to speak in Brazil before the Senate in Brazil because they were investigating the effect of McDonald's on workers' conditions around the world. McDonald's is the second largest employer in the world and sufficiently large in the United States that 1 in 8 people in this country work at McDonald's at some point in their life. Now, I don't know what's going to happen when I ask people to raise their hands. I've had very different responses depending where I'm speaking. But how many people in this room have worked in a McDonald's?
Or fast food.
Okay. So this is the only room, it tells you something about Dartmouth. This is the only room where I have asked that question where no one has worked in McDonald's. Many of the places I've given this talk, every hand in the room goes up. So what happened is that he's invited to Brazil to look at global working conditions, and he met a McDonald's worker from Tokyo, and one from Seoul, and one from Manila, and one from Brasilia. And he said he got a chill when they rolled up their sleeve and they had the same burns on their arms in the same places. And so they began to understand that the architecture of labor in these McDonald's looks the same wherever you go. right? McDonald's looks the same, and the architecture of the workspace is the same, right? And so they began to call it really the brands of the new wage slavery. They're literally branded. And so, you know, then again, in imagery, Liz has an image that's not here that's so incredible. It's, we interviewed a bunch of fast food worker activists in Manila and told this story, and they rolled up their sleeves. And they put their arms in spokes on the table, and everybody had the burns. Everybody had the burns. So, you know, these images convey something about global solidarity and global work that you really can't convey any other way.
The only thing I'll mention before we move on is that Blue is wearing a sweatshirt that says "I Can't Breathe," which of course is what Eric Garner said before he was killed. And this really speaks to coalitions and young people's movements finding each other, not being so siloed. And we saw a lot of that. Yeah, so in the photo, I think that comes through pretty clearly.
Fight for 15, Freedom Fighters, and I Can't Breathe, you know, gives you a sense of the Fight for 15 movement that, you know, again, you can draw out in the interview. For Blue, the first time I met him, he had just come back from a gathering of 500 fast food workers in Atlanta where they were being advised by 3 survivors of the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike where Martin Luther King went and supported him where he was killed. And, you know, for Blue, he said, we're standing on the shoulders of our grandparents. And at the same time, wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt and wearing the last words spoken by a Liberian street vendor in Staten Island before he was choked to death by the New York City police, was for him, he said, we're the same people, right? Historians and political scientists may write about these movements separately. He said, but we're the people when we get off our 3rd shift because we don't make a living wage or walking home and are the ones who are harassed and beaten by the police. So for them, it's one movement. Blue is in many ways one of the narrators of the book. There are a handful of people whose voices go through. And so I just repeat one thing. When the adjunct professor said, we are all fast food workers now, Blue said, or maybe we're all professor adjuncts, which is worth thinking about.
This is also from exactly 4 years ago, New York City, in front of McDonald's.
This is a word. Is this blocking it? No, I don't think so, right? You can see what it says? God, this mic went out too now. Oh, well. It's working? Okay. Respect is the word we encountered everywhere, right? And one of the people we interviewed, Gershwila Green, who's a Walmart worker who organized a series of rides for respect modeled on the Freedom Rides, in which Walmart workers traveled across the country by bus to the headquarters of Walmart, talked about how she knew very well that half the people who got off that bus were hungry. She said, but the first, second, and third thing they wanted to talk about was respect. You know, not being yelled at on the floor, being treated with dignity. So the Walmart organization is called Organization United for Respect at Walmart, our Walmart. The Fast Food Workers Organization in Manila is called the RESPECT, Fast Food Workers Coalition. And we'll talk more about them in a second because they're a singing, dancing labor movement. But that word was core. And I think it's core to the crisis in neoliberalism right now. Right, not only the complete lack of legal protection for workers, not only the lack of a living wage, but the lack of any kind of respect or dignity on the floor.
And that's on Central Park West, right, Annalise?
Yes.
So those are, I don't know, $10, $15 million apartments?
And a $6 million slogan, which McDonald's paid Justin Timberlake $6 million to sing in the first global TV jingle ever recorded. So part of the thing about this movement is it's young. It's people in their 20s mostly that we interviewed. And it builds on global popular culture to subvert some of these heavily, these brand items like the We're Loving It, I'm Loving It campaign that McDonald's spent so much money on.
Prince and Canute, they are airport workers at JFK. And came out also in solidarity on that day 4 years ago. And
they described a really interesting dynamic of the movement. The movement is sometimes critiqued for not getting people into unions. The fast food industry has 4 million American workers, and it is mostly ununionized. But the effect of the movement has been that unions have grown tremendously. So Prince and Canute are part of a movement to organize American airports that in the fall of 2016, right at the same time as the 2016 election, resulted in 20 largest airports in the United States unionizing. And they were inspired by the kids. They said those fast food workers are our sisters and brothers, they're our children, right? And so these guys organized a union local of 8,000 workers in Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark Airport. And they did something that it said couldn't be done, because in airports, there's a million contractors, right? You work all the different little stands and all the stores, and everybody supposedly is a different employer. And you know, the general feeling is you can't organize a union with all of those contractors. They defied the odds, and the same thing happened in LAX, in Los Angeles, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and around the world. So that is the kind of intergenerational response in this movement.
I happen to love this image because I love her face.
Yeah. And these folks were already unionized, supporting the non-unionized workers, supporting the undocumented workers who came out that day to take Manhattan back. And there's a moment that this picture is a prelude to. That's one of my favorite moments in the work for this book, when those guys took over Times Square, right, in uber-gentrified Manhattan. There's very little visibility for those who run the city, right, because mostly people can't afford to live there anymore. They're living either far out on the edges of Brooklyn and Queens, or in Brighton Beach and other places, although that has become too expensive now. Or they're living in Hoboken, they're living in New Jersey, they're commuting long distances. But these guys took over Times Square, and they started singing the Fight for 15 anthem, which goes to the tune of When the Saints Go Marching In, right? We're underworked and overpaid, all we ask is $15. I mean, overworked and underpaid, excuse me, I do that every time. And they took over the city, and that is, I watched in Times Square, the center of New York tourism, people respond to them, people begin to sing, and that is a hallmark of this new movement. We're about to show you a picture of the choreographer of the Manila movement, who said to me, we know we're convincing people not, when they honk, or not when they, cheer when they see our signs, but when they start tapping their fingers and singing along.
I'm going to mention something that, again, pertains to the fire at Notre Dame, which was that people spontaneously stood as close as they could. There was a perimeter that they were not allowed to get too near, obviously, and we're singing. It was really something. Another view. And again, I mentioned the hero shots, and this is Denise and Venanzi, who we met in California.
Yeah, these women launched the first strike against the Walmart on American soil. And they did it in October 2012 when this movement began. And it's an interesting thing to think about interviews and editing interviews, or photographs and getting people to strike a pose. Because Liz said to these guys, we'd gotten lots of images of them, and said, you're badass. You struck the first Walmart. You led the first strike against the Walmart on American soil. Strike a badass pose. And even though this is a posed photograph, it captured something about them that was possible after hours of talking with them and interviewing them, that I think, could not have been captured candidly. But it opens all kinds of questions about what constitutes, a fair interview, a fair photograph.
This was an interesting interview, Annalise, if you recall. At one point, we were just sort of talking about what, their story, and at one point, Venanzi Luna, who is on that side, I guess that's the right, I don't know, said that she felt so guilty for corralling people into this movement, people who were relying on that very small wage, but yet they were risking that wage to join her, and many had lost their jobs. There was a shutdown of an entire Walmart, and people lost their jobs. And Venanzi walked around feeling very guilty about that, to the point where she went to a very dark place. And so in the interviews, we hear the emotional reality of what this feels like for people. It's easy to just look at pictures and tell stories about, from a distance. But this struggle is real for people.
Yeah, the moment before she picked up, they did this badass photo. She had her head on her hands on the table, and she was crying because she felt like their strike had cost, when Walmart shut down that store, it cost 500 families their living. And eventually the National Labor Relations Board ordered them to hire people back, but they only hired so many back. And so that's the other side, right? In these moments that you capture. We capture the heroic moments because people are heroes. And Venanzi said something that, she said, if we could change Walmart, we can change the world. But it is not easy, and it's not fair to them or to anyone who might get into activism to not convey the painful bits as well.
This is Jenny Mills, and we met her at a fast food restaurant on the perimeter parking lot of the shut down Walmart. And she told us that she had been living in her car. That car. With her partner and cat.
And a plant.
And then using the restroom at the fast food restaurant to shower while she protested Walmart.
And she had gotten involved for her son, who was injured in one of the classic scenarios of today's labor force, which is that employers, even when they have regular employees and not contract workers, they routinely underhire. And the result of underhiring and having too few people is that people get hurt. Her son had gotten hurt. Her son had been forced to come back or lose his job. And when he had to go back to work, picking up boxes and doing all the things you do to Walmart, he became so seriously injured that he now has been unable to move fully and fluidly for the last 3 years. And so here's a woman who's been living in her car for 2 years, who said, I don't regret anything. I don't regret anything. We have to do this for our kids.
This is Margarita. She is a berry picker in Oxnard, California. And we flew out there and heard stories as well of that really difficult, really grueling, and very, very common experience.
These are the people on the border. These are everyone we interviewed who picks our berries, who picks our lettuce, who pick grapes for the wine we drink and the fruit we eat. All of this group is the Mixteco Community Organizing Project in Ventura, California, Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project. She was involved in a women's group to train translators because nobody can speak these indigenous languages, right? And so they were trying to get these women work as translators in courthouses, in hospitals when people are giving birth. And Margarita was really tired and really angry and really reluctant to have her photograph taken because she thought that labor had toughened her face and coarsened her. But what was really interesting is that she said that when she started to work, she realized that she had benefited from workers who had struck and lost their jobs before her. She had learned the story, through this organizing project of the workers who'd come before, and she, wanted to be part of this project and wanted to be part of this Mixteco Community Organizing Project, which did anti-domestic violence work and helped people to access health care and did cultural programming, helped the kids to maintain these indigenous languages. She wanted to be part of it because she understood that she benefited from those who came before her. She was still really pissed, though, and you can see it in her face.
But she let me take a picture. And this is Salsa.
Yes.
And he is another Mixteco, I believe?
Mixteco.
Yeah, berry picker. He was happy to have his picture taken. This is Homer, and we met him in Pasadena.
Yeah.
At a 5 for 15 rally that they were organizing there, trying to get local government on board believe he was in
Homer's a
front of
college
City Hall.
student. He's a poet. He's 19. He's a poet. He's a photographer, and he said he had to become an activist because other people he worked with were mothers with kids, and they couldn't afford to lose their jobs. And so Homer had become involved with a group of McDonald's workers that was working together with McDonald's workers in Japan, right, to raise wages in both settings.
Bernardino. He has an interesting story. I think he was with United Farm Workers. And we've heard this story a few times, and you'll see another image of people who were brutalized for their efforts to organize, and he was one of them.
One of the things that happens in this environment of fear is that we learned from the farm workers and from Bernardino that farm owners bring in people wearing uniforms that they intend the workers to think are American military, even though they're privately hired security firms, because they feel that people will be afraid that they'll be deported. And so he was trying to explain to people what was going on in 2012 and 13, and right now. He was tasered in the fields. He took a lawsuit into the courts to explain that he was tasered in the fields by one of those private security companies for attempting to organize the people who pick our food. He won. He took it to court. And when we published this book, we didn't put full names on the undocumented people. We just called him Bernardino. And he was mad. He wanted to be Bernardino Martinez. He said, I went to court. I used my name. I want to be recognized for what I did and who I am. So I give you the very courageous Bernardino Martinez.
Annalise.
Here we go. Okay. Leigh Cataman, 23-year-old musical theater major, who is in Manila, and he decided that he wanted to use his musical theater chops for something that would have a more lasting impact. And Leigh became the choreographer of the RESPECT Fast Food Workers Alliance. And he is in this photograph showing us a bit of the choreography to their signature song, RESPECT, after the Aretha Franklin hit. He has also choreographed flash mob protests shutting down traffic in Manila for a living wage to Katy Perry's Firework. There was on International Women's Day before the presidential palace a flash mob to Helen Reddy's I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, which only a few people in this room are old enough to remember. But I must tell you that the obsession with 1970s American R&B in Manila is an amazing thing. But perhaps their most famous moment, and the moment that drew me to this singing, dancing, labor organizing, was in a global strike of fast food workers in 2014 on 40 countries on 6 continents, right, shutting down McDonald's. They all work for the same employer. He helped choreograph a singing, dancing conga line of teenage girls who pulled out the workers on strike singing their own lyrics to Let It Go from Disney's animated hit Frozen. So it's a new kind of labor movement, and these are the faces, and maybe sometime I'll be able to show you the videos of these. They're quite amazing.
They are on YouTube.
Yes.
Oh, okay, so this is Kalpona, actor. And Annalise will hopefully begin to do Kalpona justice. I don't know if that's possible in a short period of time.
I can. We're running out of time. But she began the book. I think what's interesting from a visual perspective in terms of visual information is that this is printed in the book in black and white. And it's a very different image, as you can see. And one of the things that Kalpona has always stood for is she is a garment worker, a union organizer in Bangladesh. One of the things she does, I first met her in 2011 on the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire when she came to New York as part of a global attempt to bring the world's attention to the conditions under which our clothing is made in Bangladesh. And one of the things she did is she asked everybody to look at labels on each other's shirts and clothing. If you did, you would find the global garment industry on your backs and on your sleeves. And so Kalpona likes to wear the handmade clothing. right? To give a sense of the difference between the world that she came from, where those who make the clothing are valued, and the world that she now occupies, where upwards of 4 million people, most of them women in Bangladesh, make clothes for the fast fashion revolution. She started working when she was 12. She was a union organizer. When garment industry moved to Bangladesh because it was the cheapest place on earth to make clothing, she has now done more than anybody else, traveling the world tirelessly to help people understand that fires are not a thing of the past, right? There were upwards of 600 fires in Bangladeshi garment factories between 2006 and the present time. And that, as she said, when the first thing that sparked this project was when she walked up in the Great Hall of the People in Cooper Union in Manhattan, where the biggest women's strike in American history had started in 1909. And she stood in front of the daughter of the woman who started that strike, who was 95, and she said, in Bangladesh, it's not 2011, it's 1911. And that's one of the things that we've learned in traveling around the world for this project. It's not just 1911 in Bangladesh. Because it's 1911 in Bangladesh, it's 1911 here again, too, in the way clothing is made, in the way workers can, workers' wages, what they will buy, their coverage under labor laws, safety conditions, all of it. So, but I do think it's really interesting. If you look at the book, those of you who will, you'll see that this is a very, very different image in black and white, and some of those are questions we can answer. But Kalpona is also a happy story because she pioneered what I believe is the future of the labor movement, and that is worker-led social responsibility codes. In the aftermath of the 2013 Rana Plaza factory collapse, which killed 1,200 and injured another 2,500 workers, and it's the worst disaster in the history of the garment industry, she was able to learn from tomato pickers in Florida that the thing to do now is go to the top of the supply chain. And so that's what she did in a consumer, union, worker, collaboration, and collaboration with corporations. She got 225 corporations that make our clothing globally to sign on to the Bangladesh Fire and Building Safety Accord, which puts the biggest clothing companies in the world, Zara, H&M, Abercrombie and Fitch, and many, many others, Primark, Topshop, they agree that workers can choose people to inspect factories for safety, that workers can be the ones who say whether women are sexually assaulted on the job, and that if the workers' chosen inspectors find safety violations, those companies agree to pay for it. The only reason that happened is because of the work, because of Kalpona's tireless traveling around the world, and because of people like you who insisted that those companies take a stand. All I can tell you is there and in Cambodia, where we saw garment workers, all you had to do is mention United Students Against Sweatshops in the United States, and people teared up because they believed that United Students Against Sweatshops has saved lives and continues to around the world.
Just for the last bit, we're going to go through some images pretty quickly, just to show you some of the other stuff that we were interested in. We were invited into people's homes. This photo really reminds me of the Rebbitzin because it's so different from my experience. And even her gaze reminds me of the Rebbitzin's gaze.
These are Cambodian beer promoters, young women whose families have lost their land, and they end up living in Phnom Penh, trying to earn a living for their family. Not so different from old Yankee mill girls leaving the farms here and going to the factories.
It's worth mentioning this was shot in virtual darkness, almost pitch darkness, by the light of a cell phone, because any amount of electricity that was in these dwellings was used to charge cell phones.
Worker housing, these are called dormitories. These are how the people live who these are waitresses, they promote beer, they're hired by Carlsberg Beer in Denmark.
And they leave their families in the countryside in some cases, and they leave their children in some cases to go into the city to work.
But that's Tep Sarong, who if you read my book, she's 35, all the other young women are like 18, 16, 18, 19. She's kind of the mother of them all, and she is the one who describes the union as her second mother for caring about them all. And then she's really these girls' second mother. But it's an interesting kind of language about unionism that's very different from the sort of brawny masculine language.
She was lucky her child came to visit. This is Che Amoni. You'll notice he's got a scar on his forehead too.
Again, the brands of wage slavery. Every Cambodian garment worker we interviewed pulled off a helmet or pulled up their hair to show that scar from being beaten after contract negotiations, often after successful ones. So again, these images of the brands of wage slavery are hard to talk about and very easy to see.
So this image isn't really consistent with what was the thesis of the book, but this is a moment that I'll never forget of how people live around the world, and that's part of the kind of yin and yang, the duality of doing this work is, Annalise and I have talked about it many times, you know, we left this moment in Happyland in Manila, in Metro Manila, and went back to our hotel, and but obviously being sensitive to the moment, you know, to people's experience matters a great deal.
One of the stories behind the story of the crisis in neoliberalism is that we have the biggest refugee crisis in the world since World War II. 1 in 14 people on the planet is on the road. And they often end up in these mega slums, in these mega cities. And this is a neighborhood in one of those mega slums, Tondo in Manila, that unbelievably is called Happyland.
This was a moment in Happyland as well. She was mourning the death of her 18-year-old daughter. And kids will be kids.
And kids will be kids, right? We were very struck by it.
And we call this the garlic peelers, just something about these women sitting day in, day out, peeling garlic to be used in restaurants around Manila.
Well, everyone in Happyland was working all the time, even the little kids. Constant work harder, I think, than anything we can imagine. But it just was in your face, this notion of the poor, right, as somehow poor because they're not working. Everyone we saw there, from the littlest kids who were keeping the drains clean so that the floods wouldn't, get in their family's few belongings, to the garlic ladies who peeled garlic for almost every restaurant in Manila.
And these are two of our, heroes as well. This is Tarat and Vunem. And they are, Vunem is a member of a rock band, and they go out and spread the word, and their activism is largely on the stage.
They're the last ones, right?
That's
yes,
it.
Come back to them. Just one final word about them. It isn't always safe in an age of dictatorship to organize protests in the old-fashioned form. So these folks, or unions, these folks organize something called the United Sisterhood Alliance. They organize fashion shows to tell the story, as they say, beautiful clothes, ugly reality. They sing in a rock band, right, traveling the country, spreading the word about the lives of garment workers. So it's also a movement that's living in the interstices, in the shadow of brutal dictators like Hun Sen of Cambodia, and again, very much young people, and you have a sense of their spirit and their militance and their joy from that photograph. Okay. Thoughts, questions?
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Anybody have any thoughts? Yes. Someone. Okay, good.
Hi, my name is Kyle. I have a question. We're having a conversation in the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy. So what forms of public policy what actions or laws can be passed in the United States to address this?
Okay. There are living wage laws all over the country. I'm testifying on Thursday at for the Vermont legislature, which is considering New Hampshire is one of the few states in the country that doesn't have a minimum wage period. So living wage legislation is really key. Sick day legislation up until the 2016 election, most low wage workers in the country didn't get a single sick day a year. Those also are very much on the agenda, and it's not just federal, right? They're on state agendas, they're on county agendas. Paying attention to those kinds of things, sexual violence and maternity leave, all of those are big issues around the world, and also the rights of people to their land. The United Nations is right now considering an international resolution for the rights of people who work the land. So I would pay attention to all of those things. I would also pay attention to the new Bangladesh Fire and Building Safety Accord. You can very easily go on that website and just buy clothes. If you're going to buy from big global producers, buy from those who've signed that. But we can also learn from them. The Manila folks, in the midst of the Duterte dictatorship, this violence in which an estimated somewhere between 6,000 and 17,000, Filipinos have been killed by his regime, they managed to pass a maternity leave law that would be the envy of this country, right? And they managed to pass a law that said, if you've worked for a company for 4 months, you're no longer a temporary worker. You have to be considered an employee and be covered by labor law. So we have a lot to learn, not only from those struggling here, but from those struggling abroad under much tougher circumstances who are achieving a lot.
There is an article that I read a couple of days ago about John Deere, the tractor manufacturer, and evidently you were not allowed to repair your own tractor. You have to go to an authorized John Deere dealer, much as we do with our iPhones. There aren't parts, and the article talked about how a lobbyist or a representative from the John Deere company actually was writing legislation about spare parts. And it's just such an obvious and so clear demonstration that corporations are writing legislation. If you can't have if you're a farmer and you can't have your tractor fixed, that's not good.
Yeah, and I think, this whole idea of who writes legislation, there have been moments in American history and moments in other parts of the world when there was an attempt to have workers involved in writing legislation. And I think that's a question for those of you involved in public policy, right, about whether or not, we should be having legislation written by corporations and having no voice, from those who, experience the hardships.
Well, we'd like to invite everybody upstairs in Hinman Forum, which is the atrium upstairs, for a look at some of the original photographs, and also there's some refreshments.
Food.
Thank you all very,
Food and
very
drink.
much. Thank you all.